Back to succession stories. True to the name of the show, we've got an incredible succession story to share with you today. My guest has so much experience from her own story that you're going to love to hear about. And she's going to share how she works with other businesses to help them with their succession stories as well. So I'm not going to bury the lead. I'm just going to tell you how it is. She's a third generation leader who helped her company, helped her family go through the emotional roller coaster of selling the family business. Christin, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
We met in Chicago not too long ago at a Private Directors Association conference. And I think pretty quickly you and I vibed on the topic of succession and how much of an emotional roller coaster this can be. And I just thought your story was amazing. I got to hear a session with you and heard you talk about your experience. And I thought immediately you would be amazing for our audience. So let me ask you, just right out of the gates, tell me about your family business.
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to share my experience and hopefully it helps others in their succession process. Yeah, so our family business was I'll say, third generation family business with five of us shareholders. So I say that and sometimes I call it a 2.5 generation business. And I say that because my father and my grandfather started the business together. And it was an automotive aftermarket parts remanufacturing business. So think about going to get your car fixed, your brakes changed or whatever. They take the old brakes off and put new ones on. We actually took the old brakes that they took off and remanufactured those into like new parts for your car. So we could sell parts at much less expensive than going and buying a brand new part for your car. So yeah, our business was basically automotive in the manufacturing space here in the Philadelphia area. And my father and grandfather started it in 1971. And over time grew it to, at its height, we had about 6,000 employees. So 6,000 employees, a little bit over a billion in revenue. And I would say, we had a relatively small shareholder group, as I shared. There were five of us in my immediate family. And usually third generation businesses have cousins and all kinds of other people in the business. And it was really just myself and my brother and my father working actively either in the business or on the board. So yeah, so that was
Wow. That's that's
that.
incredible
Yeah.
growth story. And let's just give a perspective. Anyone that's watching us on YouTube and our YouTube channel, Business Transition Sherpa YouTube channel, they can see you, right? And they can see you and you're guessing maybe your age. And I'm thinking you're probably around the age that I am, and our birthdays are probably around the same time, which is probably around the same time that your father and your grandfather founded the company. Am I right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So not only is
It's
he giving, he's having his family and raising his family, and he's got a relatively new company at this time. So you've got a sibling or couple siblings?
Yep. I have two brothers. My older brother came into the business right out of college, and my younger brother never really got involved in the business and kind of went his own way. And I, graduated college and had spent most of my summers growing up working in the business, and then decided, I really needed to go out and see if there's female leaders in the world and to see, kind of get some experience outside the business. And I never really had the intention to go back and work in the business. So I just kind of went on my way and eventually, joined the board. And and then a few years into joining the board, our primarily we had a majority independent board of directors, and they got together and asked me to come back and work in the business when my father retired.
Okay, so we're skipping a lot of years here. I think there's a
Yeah.
couple key points because
Yeah.
I get this question a lot and I see it a lot too in the work that I'm doing with clients and when they're considering next generation or skip level generation types of decisions for succession. So let's just stay with on your story for a moment. So you were in the business kind of casually, right? Interning, summer, stuff like that. And then to go get outside work experience, you felt like it was really important. At that point, it wasn't something in your company, family bylaws or anything that you had to do that. You just felt like you wanted to do that. Okay. And you chose
Yes.
to work in a big company. I know you worked at J&J for a number of years. And what was your focus? I know you were on the business side of things. You were in human resource management. Is that correct?
No, I actually started my career in technology.
Okay.
So, yeah, I just basically, you know, went where I could get a job outside the family business. I think, a lot of us growing up in a family business sometimes think that's our only option. And so I took the first opportunity that came my way and, networked my way into an internship at J&J and ended up in IT and then eventually marketing and kind of that crossover of IT and marketing when the internet kind of appeared on the scene. So yeah, so I got all kinds of really great experience and leadership development there. I was in the women's leadership program and the IT leadership program. So I got a lot of really great training, mentoring, coaching, and leadership development there, being in
Awesome.
a big company.
So you're getting that outside perspective. You're growing your career. At the same time, Cardone Industries is probably doing very, very well and growing. And as you said, the company had formed a fiduciary board. Around what size of the business do you recall? How big in revenue it was when it formed that board?
You know, we were definitely a few thousand employees. There was a point in time, I'll say in the 90s, where, our company really transformed and accelerated growth because we took on the retail side, large retail customers in the automotive space. And that, dramatically changed our growth trajectory. And, you know, our at that point, you start borrowing from the banks or, they see you in a different light and really bringing on that fiduciary board at that point of time. And prior to that, just like every family business, should do before they do fiduciary board, is really have a group of advisory, if you want to call it advisory board, and start there with, I'll say friends and family advisors, whatever it is. For us, it was like our attorney and a financial advisor to my dad and my grandfather, and then you start maturing that and bringing on different disciplines and experiences. And so I would say we probably brought on the fiduciary board the middle of the 2000s time frame. I think that's probably when we brought them on.
Okay. And you had said that the board was thinking about succession, or board was addressing succession. Your father was thinking about retiring. About how many years in advance did he start to have that
Mm.
conversation?
Yeah, I always say my dad was really unique and special in a lot of ways. He ended up retiring in his early 70s, which is very rare in these, multi-generational family businesses. And I think he had a lot of just really good coaching himself over the years where, he wanted to start thinking about that. And we also had, which a lot of family businesses, we had this gap in between myself and my brother's experience and ability to take over the CEO role at the size of the company that we were at. And when he wanted to retire, that gap was, we needed something to bridge that. So we eventually started the recruitment process, for a non-family CEO to kind of bridge that gap for us. And my dad, I would say he had been thinking about succession for at least 5 to 8 years. I mean, he was really progressive in his thinking around, I don't want, I know he would say, I know I'm the limitation for this company to grow and really needs like the next generation of leadership. And I really appreciate that about him. I mean, he just was always thinking ahead and trying to get ahead of the whole conversation about, who was going to be next to take over. So, yeah.
Yeah. So when they approached you and said, "Hey, we would like you to join the board," were they also asking for you to join as an operator in the business or just as up for a board seat?
So I initially joined for the board seat, and even 2 years before, I was sitting in the board meetings as an observer, which I think is a huge benefit, and it's a really great opportunity and way for families to bring their next generation along, and so they can learn and hear and also get to know the board members. So I was a board observer for a few years, and then they asked me to join the board, and yeah, they did not ask me to join as an operator at that point in time. I was doing my own thing, my own career, you know, just kind of tunnel vision in the other direction, and so it really wasn't the right time for me. And there were different times over many, many years where my father would ask me, like, how about you come and join us, and work in the business? And I'd say, well, that sounds great. Tell me what the job description would be. And we could never figure that part out. And I just had this intuition that, I was getting really good development and learning outside the business. And, it wasn't really the right thing for me to do at that time in my career. So I just continued serving on the board and felt like that was a really great way for me to serve my family and still feel connected. It helped me, kind of jump back in and feel like I was being supportive of my dad and my brother and my mom, and just helping the business in whatever way I could and contributing with my experience and learning a whole lot, from the other independent board members. So it was a really good way of starting, to get ready to go back to go into the operating business.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's focus on the topic of succession for a moment. I always like to clarify there's two general flavors of succession that I work on with my clients. And of course, we address on this show quite regularly. One is succession of leadership, and the other is succession of ownership. You mentioned just a moment ago your father's intention to retire and not having family quite ready and sort of a skip generation
Yeah.
solution of looking for an outside CEO. So that clearly is a leadership succession. So I want to talk
Hmm.
about that, and then we're going to segue and we're going to talk about the ownership succession. So I know everyone's really excited to kind of understand the exit, but we're going to talk about this first. And I think in terms of sequence, it's super critical, right? We can't kind of go to
Yeah.
the exit until we've got our leadership team in place. So what was the process of going about finding an external CEO?
Yeah, so that was a really interesting process. I was on the board at the time, and we formed an ad hoc recruiting like search committee. So myself and I think it was two or three other board members. There was a group of us where we worked with an executive search firm to find someone who had automotive experience, industry experience, had some experience kind of, modernizing, professionalizing, taking a business from, a, smaller functioning business, even though we weren't small, but everybody knows kind of the entrepreneurship journey. And there are a lot of things when you bring someone in from the outside, you're doing that to kind of professionalize, bring in best practices. So we did a search, and we found the person who we felt on paper was this perfect resume that matched everything that we required for the business, and ended up, hiring this person as our first non-family CEO. That was the
Amazing.
process.
And that person also joined the board or no?
He did join the board, yes.
Okay, gotcha. So he wasn't on the board first. He joined in as the CEO and then he joined as a member of the board. Okay, great. Now, also, you are contemplating joining the business as an operator. At what point did you join vis-a-vis this new CEO coming in?
Yeah, so about 18 months in to his tenure, the board started talking to me about coming into the business. And there were challenges, as there always is with any, non-family CEO following a founder. I think that's, people say that's one of the hardest things to do, is follow a founder. And there were some challenges at that point, about 18 months into his tenure, where the board was talking about, number one, talking to me about, hey, we really would love for you to bring your skill set into the business. They could use you. There are a lot of issues around culture, and that first non-family CEO not necessarily focusing on culture, and really, bringing that family perspective, and with good experience, they were really, asking me to join. So, yeah, I was supposed to join in when we also made that decision about 18 to 20 months probably into his tenure, that we were going to make a change in the CEO role. And the plan was to bring on one of our board members who had been a board member for 2 years and also a CEO of another family business. He was a non-family executive in a family business before, had been in that seat a few times. And so we started talking about he and I going into the business together. And timing got a little bit messed up, and I ended up joining the company in September, and we ended up letting him go in December. So it was a little bit of a challenge for a few months when, I think the writing was on the wall for the first non-family CEO, and the board basically said, hey, the boss's daughter is coming into the business. So it was a little awkward in a variety of ways, but it ended up, working out. And we had to actually have our chairman be interim CEO for a few months, just because the next CEO, who was a board member with me, was finishing up his assignment at the previous family business. So he had a few more months before he could be freed up. So anyway, it worked out, and
Wow,
then
that's
he joined
challenging. You
us.
had some rotation in that CEO chair. That must have been really challenging and felt stressful for a few years.
Yeah, it was really, I would say for a good 9 months, it was challenging because, it was my first kind of my first foray into executive leadership at our family business. And I felt like I had a lot of work to do, just kind of reviving the culture and getting, leaders aligned, and, setting new strategy. And I didn't really have a strong support structure from a CEO at that point in time, and knew we would be changing it. So I kind of felt like I was like, stopping the dam, putting my finger in the dike, and just trying to keep things, in on a good path. And once we got our next CEO in place, he and I worked really well together on the board, and we had been on a few committees together. So I was really excited for him to come on board, and eventually he was the CEO that I worked with to sell the business.
Okay, and so you came in, and in what capacity? What was your function?
Yeah, so I had worked hard with the board to come up with a rotation plan. I really wanted to come into the business and learn all the different areas and, kind of have a general manager like rotation. And it was kind of natural for me at that point to join into HR organizational development first because I had, gotten my coaching certification in between working at J&J and to where I was at this point in time. And I was actually coaching next generation family business leaders. That was like something I was really passionate about. Young leaders really wanting to figure out what their place was in the family business and the enterprise and the, family system. And so, yeah, so I joined in and in that role and very quickly, a few months in, ended up having to let our VP of HR go. So I ended up stepping into that role and staying there for a couple years. So that was not the original plan on the GM track, rotation track that I was planning on doing, but I know it was the right thing, and I really loved my role leading kind of the talent and organizational strategy of the company. And we really needed to do some dramatic transformation just with the infrastructure of, HR and leadership development and kind of culture and strategy and aligning them and kind of reviving our our culture from a family perspective and modernizing some things and getting the organization in a way that we could support more growth.
It's interesting to talk to you from a couple of vantage points, just to kind of recap, what have we talked about so far? Family business, you made a decision to not join, then you made a decision to join the board, then you made a decision to join as in the operations of it and help get the next level of management in place, which included a new outside CEO. Whoa, that's a lot.
Yeah.
Your brother, where was he at this point? One of the
Yeah.
brothers, one brother was not in the business. The one that joined the business,
Right.
what was he doing?
Yeah. So he came into the business right after college. So he had been there the whole time, and when he was on the board with me when I was on the board, and he had been in the business. Yeah, it was his kind of career, and he had rotated through different areas and spent a lot of time in sales and marketing. And when I came in, I think he was a little bit, tired and burnt out, kind of like shouldering a lot of the burden of, having such a large family business. And, it's just he and my dad kind of in the business and working it. And so I was, really thrilled to be able to kind of jump in and help support him in his role. And we worked really well together. He and I are like, different personalities with different skills. And it was, yeah, it was really fun kind of jumping in and he and I getting to see each other and work together, on a regular
Yeah, it's
basis
like a whole
in
new
the operating
relationship
business.
that you had with
Yeah.
your brother and your family business. Was he disappointed to know that he wasn't the CEO successor?
No, I think he had been so, kind of the focus had been on him for so long, and as that he was going to be the successor. And I think we always had that in mind, that he would still be the successor at some point. So he was not disappointed at all when we brought in non-family CEOs. I think he and I, we both realized like we had a lot to learn and we still had some growing to do. And when they asked him, do you want to be the CEO? And he just for him, his skill set was, really different, what he was interested in. And at that point it was a really big job. So, I kind of look back on it and say, if the two of us could have been co-CEOs, that probably would have been a great scenario. And there are there are scenarios where that works really well. We know that there's not very many of them out there in the world, but I think from a family business perspective, I wish I would see more of that, because I think, the CEO role in general is a kind of like impossible role for any one person to be 100% great at. And we know that CEOs out there have plenty of support behind the scenes. They might have executive coaches, they've got consultants, they've got all kinds of people to fill in for, their shortcomings. And I think, my brother and I at some point in the future would have been great co-CEOs together. And we could have been a really good team together, at some point down the road.
It's interesting now to reflect, right? We've talked a lot about leadership succession, and now I want to switch gears and talk about the ownership succession. I know this is a complicated part of the story. At one point, the board must have said, hey, and I should ask you, I guess, before we jump into that, the equity, who the stakeholders were, the owners, family only, or had you taken on outside capital? So the decision makers were,
Yeah.
and the shareholders were only family at that point?
Yeah, we were just our family, had not taken on any additional investment. And that was something that was in the forefront of my mind, honestly, when I came into the business, really to try to convince my family to bring on a minority partner, consider doing some other option. I mean, the business was getting so big, and when we had to invest in some type of really large capital project, it was always a real big stress on my dad. And, as he's getting older, his risk tolerance was going down. It's the kind of that the opposing forces of the senior generation and the younger generation wanting to grow the business. And it's, happens very frequently where, they start getting more risk averse, and the younger generation is wanting to invest and grow the business. And so we were 100% family owned. And honestly, looking back, I always say my father was a solopreneur, and which to me meant that he was not really going to ever consider. Now, he did consider bringing on minority partners in a very surfacey manner, or hey, maybe I think our only way to grow is to go public, or here are some other options, but never really deeply considering those options. Even though my brother and I a number of times brought those ideas and options to the board and as discussion to try to see what were some different ownership succession plans that we could put in place where we could keep the business, my brother and I, could be transitioned, and we could continue to grow the business. But I think in the back of my dad's mind, the business got so big and the need for investment capital was so large. And looking also down the road at industry headwinds coming at us, we're in the automotive combustion engine business, and thinking about all the electric car require, the parts business from the electric car standpoint is a totally different business. It's more of a technology business, really. And so I think in his mind, we needed to consider, when people approached us to buy the business, that we should be entertaining those options. And we did over time. There's many times throughout the last 20 years where strategic buyers would approach the board, approach my dad, and we didn't really start taking any of them seriously until about 4 years before we actually sold the business.
I found an article, it was around 2011, 2012, that acknowledged there was a deal that didn't go through. What was the year the business sold?
2019.
Oh, 2019.
May of 2019.
Yeah, so about 5 years ago. So this is obviously all in retrospect. As you look back now and you think about the board discussions that were being had about strategic transition planning, what would you give as some words of advice to companies that don't have a fiduciary board, but the importance of those conversations and how a privately held company should be thinking about strategic transition planning?
Yeah, I mean, our board, I would say, helped the spur those conversations on. Probably, was the reason why we actually were so advanced in those conversations, because we basically talked about them at least once a year, a number of years before. And anytime, obviously, we were approached, that kind of got us talking and thinking and strategizing about, how would we say yes? What were the conditions we would say yes to entertaining the sale of the company? So if companies don't have a board of directors, I think it's really important to have great advisors in, from wherever they feel, that they trust the most. Maybe it's your attorney or a financial advisor. Probably, it would have made sense for us to talk to someone like you in the process if we didn't have a board. I mean, your voice in this whole conversation is probably, more holistic than just an attorney or just a financial advisor. So, so having someone like you kind of coaching that conversation along would have been great. But yeah, I think it's really important. There's organizations like the Exit Planning Institute where I speak for them every once in a while, and they have, this conversation around exit planning, but there's a lot of business owners there who don't actually, they're not planning on selling their business, but they're trying to set it up to where it is, most ready if they would ever consider it. And I think, taking the approach that my father had with our board and the plan of actually having a fiduciary board eventually is really something to kind of, strive for. And, depending on whatever size your business is, and like kind of working towards that, because they help you think about these moments that could just be sprung on you as a business owner. Someone approaches you with an offer you can't refuse. Okay, well, are you ready to handle the whole due diligence process? Do you have your financials in order? Do you have the right, how do you communicate to your man and involve your management team, or do you not? And there's so many of those questions that are really, they're big questions. And the sale of a business really puts a lot of stress and pressure on the existing management team. It's almost like you need to hire a couple people to help you work through that, because no one has a bunch of extra leaders or analysts sitting around doing nothing. And the due diligence process is very stressful and very onerous, and it's important to get it right. So I think, if you don't have an advisory board or a fiduciary board in place, it's important to almost like, build a little, maybe it's an ad hoc group of advisors to say, hey, if something comes our way, can we bring you together, and, you can be kind of an ad hoc advisory board or something to that effect. It's really important to have outside advisors who have done this and have, been there, done that, seen a bunch of different ways to do a sale and or a transition. Because even if you're not selling your company and you're transitioning it to the next generation, there is really kind of a due diligence process of some sort where you're like, hey, what do we need? How are we going to do this? How are we going to change the ownership structure? How are we going to do this in a tax efficient way? All of those things are really important.
It's a super complicated process. It takes, in a short end, 3 to 5 years to really get ready. And yes, Exit Planning Institute and folks like myself that have a certified exit planning advisory
Yeah.
certification. It's a lot of work, and I really appreciate everything you said, because some people think, oh, I can just put my company on the market, but they themselves are not ready and the company's not ready. So your company was clearly gearing up for a future transition. It was proactive. You had a process to discuss these things in a organized way. And I want to talk a little bit about the transaction, and then from I'll call it the wallet, whatever you're able to share. And then I want to talk about the transaction from a heart standpoint. And so the mind and the heart, and from a different vantage point. Okay, so the nuts and the bolts and so on. Did you hire an investment banker, or did you guys handle the transaction? As you were saying, there's a lot to do and all the steps with
Yeah.
diligence, et cetera. Did you hire a banker to run a process, or did you guys handle the process yourself?
We actually ended up handling the process ourselves, which I don't really recommend. However, our CEO had done that before, and now ironically works in an investment bank and advises family businesses on this process. So he had a lot of experience doing that. We also went through a financial recap the previous year, so we had done a lot of the due diligence work for that process with our internal finance team, and also help from our existing bank. So I guess we kind of had more of a baby step process to the final sale, and had already had a big hurdle to get over doing the financial recap, and then just kind of added on to that process eventually and through the sale.
Did you approach different buyers, and say, hey, we're interested in you buying us? Or how did you get buyers to the table?
Yeah, we actually, our bank, our primary bank in our syndicate, really kind of helped us through that process. And then we basically, myself, our CEO, and our CFO went up to New York, and we just did kind of the private equity dog and pony show for a couple days, and did our presentations there. And from that process, ended up with a couple of offers. And yeah, that's how it happened.
Okay, and the
And
sale
not
went
easy,
through.
not easy.
Not easy. And the sale went through with a private equity group. Is that correct?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
And so, yeah, from
Mhm.
end to end, how long did that all take?
Oh, wow. Well, if I took out the recap process happened about 10 to 12 months before, and we ended up selling to the private equity company that did our recap. So that's another piece that kind of made the process a little bit easier.
What was the
Um,
recap? What went into that?
So the recap was basically, we had used our, wonderful local bank for many, many years. And, our bank was a well-known national bank, but we had always worked with our local, Pennsylvania bankers. And they worked with a certain size of business, and we had outgrown them a long time ago. And it was just, relationships that my father and my grandfather had for so long. And we really kind of outgrew their, kind of their group of companies that they funded. And we just got to a point where we needed to have some expansion capital. We needed to build onto our plant in Mexico. We needed a distribution center in Texas. We needed, there were a variety of really big capital projects that were just outside of their realm of funding. And um we had been talking about doing that for many years, and finally we got to that point where we really needed to take on a different, more flexible financial structure.
Gotcha. So let's talk about the emotional roller coaster of all of this. I'm sure there were ups and downs through the whole process with the PE firm, negotiating and all, again, those transactional things. I know that's not easy, from my own experience and from working with clients firsthand.
Yeah.
And it takes time. And so we go up and down on, oh, is this the right deal? And is it the right terms and all of that stuff? Now let's talk about the emotional side. Was there a point in the process where your father was just feeling, oh, I don't want to sell, I can't let go yet, or that you were feeling that way, or your brother or your mom or anybody else who could have vetoed the deal?
You know, I think at that point we had already exhausted, during I would say that I'm saying that 9, 10 month time period from when we, recapped and then to the sale. I think at that point in time we had already started dealing with some of the emotions of like, hey, if there's a possibility for us to sell, are we all ready to do that? Do we feel ready? And my brother and I, a few years earlier, actually, went through this process together. We hired a family business consultant to help us look at and interview, investment banks, interview attorneys, interview all kinds of advisors who could help us actually, buy my dad out and transition the business to us. And we just, came up against so many different issues and reasons why, it was just not going to happen. I think um we tried to look at all different, funding models, bringing in minority partners, all kinds of things, and we just got to a point where we realized, my dad had one thing in his mind and had been always thought about, selling the business as a whole. And the more, like I said earlier, about, the industry headwinds and different challenges that we were coming up against, the size of investment that we needed to take on, was just, in his mind, he didn't want to saddle us with with those challenges. And so I think by the time, the year that we ended up selling, the end of 2018 and into 2019, we were all kind of emotionally over the wall that, like, if we got an opportunity, a good offer, like, we're going to just take it. And now there were moments where, we thought the business was sold one day and we all went out to have dinner, and then you know how the negotiations go, then a few days later it's like, oh, I don't know if this is going to go through. And then it's like you said, it's an emotional roller coaster, and it is something that is really hard to plan for, that part of it. I think, it's important to, like we talked about earlier, having these conversations sooner than later. How does everybody feel about selling the business? My younger, ironically, my younger brother, who wasn't in the business, was not excited to sell the business and didn't really want us to sell it. And so it was hard for him because he wasn't really engaged in the business at all to have a voice in the process, because my brother and I were working in the business and we were supportive of it, as we saw, the offers that we were getting, we said, okay, this is a great opportunity. um should we take it, should we not? And we had already kind of put our hands in the middle with my dad and my mom and said, all right, we're going to do this. So it's an emotional roller coaster, even if you have those conversations ahead of time. And if you're involved in the negotiations, so many things uh, can derail the offer process, and these little terms and conditions and all kinds of things that could just really be challenging and throw off the process. I'm sure you have a million examples of this where, little terms come back, and they, the buyer tries to change something, and the seller walks away. We did have one of those experiences a couple years earlier. where we were planning on selling to a different private equity group. And I wasn't actually involved at that point. This was prior to me being on the board, right? Like the year that I joined the board. And my father walked away, because they had that typical, you know, give you an offer and then start cutting down, cutting down, cutting down. And they're really wanting to pay this, bottom dollar price. And at that point, I don't think my father was ready to sell.
Yeah.
So he didn't. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's always the out, we're always strongest in a negotiation when we have other options. And yes, sometimes the deals fall apart from buyer side or sell side. There's any number of factors that can derail a deal, including the emotional side, which is typically why I like to ask about it. Sometimes it's just so emotional. People at the end say, I can't do it. I just can't do it. But you guys went through with it. And what was that like?
Yeah.
Tell me about the day of the closing. Were you continuing on in the business or were you out at that point?
Yeah, so I was pretty confident. I did not get a direct answer from the PE group, but we sold to a large PE group because of the size of the business we were, and I was pretty convinced that they were going to, my brother and I would be out, maybe a couple of executives. The CEO was definitely going to be out at some point, so they could bring in their own, their own CEO, their own management team, and so I didn't get a direct communication when we were closing, but a few weeks later, it was clear to me that was going to happen soon, and yeah, and so I left at that point, and yeah, that is an emotional experience. I would say that was the most challenging time of my career as a leader, because I had to go and like tell my team that I was leaving, um and they were all staying, this team and my team, and then also our executive team, and they all had kind of bought into being in a family business. They loved that part of our culture. And it was hard because it felt like in a lot of ways we were, betraying some of our employees. I mean, my dad always thought he'd never sell the business. And so that was a challenge because my dad has a lot of integrity, and I felt like I was, kind of carrying that on. But at the same time, I knew it was the right thing for the business long term. Grow, for growth. And I do hear these days in middle market and lower to middle market, PE firms don't always do that, take out the family and the executive team. But this is a very, very large private equity firm, and they probably had their playbook, and they have their bench, their operating partners, they bring them in and kind of take over all their financial consultants. You replace your CFO and everybody on the finance team, and they bring in their kind of army of financial consultants to do their work. And so it was a challenge, and it was, definitely a cultural kind of earthquake for the company from what I hear, and unfortunately, um, it's almost feels like, you had a death in the family. If you want to talk about the emotional side, is like, oh my goodness, I abandoned all these employees and the people I love and care about and have led for so many years, and my family's been so attached to. So it was really hard, and I had many, I'll say many weeks where my family, I was walking around like a zombie at home, just like trying to process it. And also, having to leave the job I really loved, and like just, had done so much really, I felt like really good work kind of building up these leaders and helping shape the company. So yeah, and I was worried honestly about like all the horror stories of family businesses selling to private equity, and kind of, eventually running it into the ground. And over time, I can say, they were not successful in selling the business for a profit after we exited the business. But the one thing I always hold on to is, I love going on LinkedIn and seeing all of our former employees. They're all doing, so many of them are doing like amazing things out there in the world with their careers and their time at Cardone. They were able to be, trained up, and now they're probably, making more money and having more impact out there in the world in other places. So I try to hold on to that.
Understandable that so many times we reflect on our identity, right? And when your name is literally on the door, Cardone is on the door. And I think 1 out of 5 businesses in the lower middle market have a family name associated. So we feel this identity. I mean, clearly your dad, your grandfather, yourself, your brothers. I mean, and I think your husband, right? You met your husband in the office.
Yep.
It's a family enterprise. It's a family culture. And all of a sudden, Elvis has left the building, and so it's very
Yeah.
understandable. I can only imagine how that felt. Very, very heavy. And you said it felt like a funeral. I can imagine for your family and also for employees. It was a big change. In some situations, it's different, right? But that was your situation, and you guys handled it as best you could, right? And you go on and you move on. And I know you've moved on. It took some time to find your groove in your next thing. Just to kind of put a pin in the planning side, I do want to say to our audience, it's so important to not only get the business ready, but to prepare personally. And it sounds like your father was doing that, but maybe on reflection, you didn't, and your brother didn't, because you didn't think you needed to. And here you were in this situation for transition for yourself. So tell me a little bit about your transition, how you found your next thing, and what you do today. Bring me up to speed on what you do today, and what you spend your time on, what gets you excited.
Yeah. So yeah, I wish I would have done some coaching along the way and some, preparing, like I am doing now, helping some, future leaders and next generation family business owners to prepare for leadership in the business or leadership in the family enterprise, whatever that happens to be. I mean, a lot of people don't go into their family business and don't have an intention to, but they still want to, help support and maybe join the board like I did. So what I'm doing now is really coaching and consulting in family businesses with leaders and talent. And then also I'm on a couple of advisory boards, and I enjoy doing board work, board governance, helping families think about that. Not so much in a formal way. There's board consultant people that help you set up boards and that kind of thing. But just, if next gen leaders want to kind of put plans in place to develop themselves and get ready to be a board member or an active shareholder, a non-active shareholder, I think it's really important to understand who you are as a person, or understand what your values are and how you can support your family's values, family business values, and at the same time, maintain who you are and kind of hold all those things together and contribute in the best way possible. So and that doesn't always mean jumping into the operating business. In fact, a lot of times it doesn't. But there's so many other ways that you can support your family in the process. So yeah, that's what I'm up to.
Absolutely. Wow, that's an amazing story. We've covered multi-decades of business growth, business readiness, business transition, and our next. There's a lot to unpack. You've covered so much, Christin, and your background and your story, your family story, and I really enjoyed that. I learned a lot. I know our audience did as well. Let's sort of recap just a little bit here and say, okay, if you're gonna say 3 things from your experience that you want to give some guidance to family-led businesses as they consider their transition planning, as they consider their next, what are 3 things that you might share?
Yeah, I think, preparing your next generation is important. And like I just said, it doesn't have to be preparing them for an operating role. Like if they are outside the business being teachers or something else, that's fabulous. But if they, if you're thinking you're going to keep the business transition to family in the longer term, it's important to have really educated shareholders, and working with, any type of advisors and coaches, I think is really important to do at a young age. Maybe it's when they're, in college and starting to think about, and some people even start earlier, just educating their families on, financials or just strategy or culture or whatever. I think it's really important. Preparing your next generation is, number one, most important. Number two is, like we talked, going back to that conversation, we talked about, whether it's, using advisors early in the process, or, just attending, Exit Planning Institute. And I know there's a multitude of other organizations, like you and I met at Private Directors Association conference. And there's all kinds of topics that you could be a family business board member and come to that conference and learn about all these different scenarios and case studies about what other family businesses are doing, and bringing those ideas back to your family. And I think, third is, like, try to have fun during, this is more, we didn't talk about this, but like, try to have fun and enjoy the process. And, and try to prepare if you think, I wish I would have been more prepared when we sold the business. And then, the time period after that, just, I wish I was so busy working in the business, I didn't take the time that I'm recommending to other people to do. I didn't take the time to really kind of reflect on how that decision was going to impact me personally. And I wish I would have, spent some time on that. So I think that gives you three things.
Yes, it does. Thank you for those reflections. I ask everyone who comes on the show if they have a favorite quote. I'm sure you have multiple. Do you have one on top of mind to share?
Oh yeah, I have so many. I like this one quote by John Quincy Adams, and I don't hear it that much, but it says, "If your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, do more, and become more, you are a leader." And I kind of go back to the fact that, like, sometimes we have these resumes, we're like, okay, that's a leader, and we can look at all these things that tell us what a leader is, but really it's about, like, inspiring others to do more and to become more. And I always hope, as a leader, and actually now what I just told you, I go on LinkedIn and I see these former employees who are doing greater things and bigger things, and just impressing me so much. That's really about leadership.
I love that. I love that. If people want to get in touch with you, learn about all the amazing things you're doing to support family businesses as they grow and transition, what's a good way for them to find you?
Yeah, they can certainly reach out to me on LinkedIn. That's probably the best way. And my website is orangestarventures.com. And that's how I do my coaching and consulting through that.
Awesome. Christin, thank you so, so much for coming on Succession Stories. I loved hearing your story, and thank you for sharing it with everyone.
Thanks for having me.
So to our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's show, you learned something, why not go to your favorite podcast player where you heard this episode and leave a rating and review. And if you're watching us on YouTube, be sure to follow us and subscribe so you get all of our latest videos. Be sure to also check out our sister podcast, The Entrepreneur Gene. This has been another great episode of Succession Stories from insights from transition to transaction. We'll see you next time. Thanks so much.